If you could proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank the committee for the invitation to participate in today's event. I will go very quickly because I know you have members of the public that traveled a long way to speak. I was asked to address three areas. The first of these areas is what is the local air district's requirements regarding closure of the Exide facility. Our requirements are found in our Rule 1420.1 as last amended this last September. Specifically, our rules require that the company continue fence line monitoring that was occurring during the operations of the facility and that it do so into the future until the facility is fully closed. That fence line monitoring is for the two key pollutants of concern, which are lead and arsenic. The lead threshold that is looked at in the monitoring that can cause them to stop operations even during the closure process is set at a level more strict than the federal outdoor air quality standard for lead. Relative to arsenic, it is also set at the threshold at a health protective level that is to help ensure that none of the closure process will result in significant arsenic exposure to the community. They're also required under our regulation to submit a compliance plan that was submitted on December 2nd of last year and is currently under review. This compliance plan is to have a description of the measures that they will do for each of the activities associated with the DTSC closure and otherwise closing the facility, so that measures are in place as they proceed with those activities with the intent to prohibit a violation of the threshold vis-a-vis the fence line monitoring. They're also required to have contingency measures so that if the monitoring shows that they've exceeded the threshold, that there are measures that can automatically be put into place so that they could continue the cleanup without violating the thresholds that we've established for the monitoring. There is to be a schedule of the measures contained in the plan so that as DTSC goes through its various phases of closure, that the measures are pre-specified for each phase. And then the plan is to be periodically updated if needed to ensure that there are adequate measures going forward as things might change during the process of the closure. If they exceed any of the monitoring thresholds specified for lead or arsenic, then they are required to stop what they are doing, to implement a pre-approved contingency measure. If no such contingency measure exists, then they're required to stop what they're doing and not start the activity up again until they have specified measures. The measures have been reviewed by our staff and approved by our staff. So they could be in a, if you will, shutdown mode until the proper measures are in place. You might be wondering, how long does the AQMD's requirements stay in place relative to closure? Our provisions apply until four separate items are met. First, that they've surrendered all their permits. Second, they submit to us a certification of final closure that has been approved by Director Lee. Third, that the final closure has been verified by us in writing back to the company. And fourth, that they've had no exceedance of the ambient monitored levels for lead or arsenic for a 12-month period, including at least 1 month post-final closure approval by DTSC. We have other regulations that also apply to these activities that are being taken at this time or under the closure. We have a Rule 1420 that requires implementation of housekeeping measures, including dust suppression and cleaning practices such as sweeping, use of HEPA filters, and wet wiping. And they are also still subject to an order of abatement from our hearing board, which is serving, if you will, as an interim protection until their compliance plan under 1420.1 is approved. And under the abatement order, any activity that has the potential to create dust must be submitted to us prior to the carrying out of the activity, along with mitigation measures, and they have to receive approval from us prior to starting that activity. I was also asked to comment on the coordination with DTSC. You've heard some testimony from Director Lee about this already. I just want to emphasize for everyone here that there is very close coordination going on between our two agencies for all aspects of activities related to Exide, technical activities as well as legal activities. Our activities are truly being conducted in a manner that is complementary to one another when one looks at the two agencies. And frankly, I think it serves as a model moving forward as to how agencies should work together. This includes cross-training of our staff. This has been enforcement staff. Our laboratory analysis staff that analyze samples have also been on the phone together. And going forward, it allows us to look at how we can leverage each other's resources in a time of need to better serve the public. The close coordination that's occurring between our agencies is not just relative to Exide. There are a number of other significant issues that both our agencies are addressing relative to other industrial facilities, and the coordination we've established through working together on Exide is now carrying over to those other efforts. Relative to Exide, I do want to note that the compliance plan under our Rule 1420.1 has been incorporated in the closure plan as Appendix G. So this is to reassure the public that the agencies are working together and that the requirements specified in the compliance plan under our rule are reflected, as Director Lee mentioned, in what ultimately DTSC will be approving. The last issue I was asked to comment on, and you've already heard some comments from Director Lee in this regard, is, okay, there's no stack emissions coming from the plant because the plant's not operating, but what about the fugitive emissions, dust and things of that nature that are created by the current activities or other activities under the closure plan? I want the committee to know that for the past 18 months, our staff has met with Exide, Exide's contractors, the third-party oversight contractor that is paid for by Exide, but under our guidance, actually twice a week in official meetings to discuss what's coming up over the next few days that requires good oversight by our agency. You've already heard that the building is still under negative pressure. The air pollution control equipment is still working, and so on. But I also want you to know that because of the seriousness of their past transgressions and the fear the community has going forward, that I have inspectors out there every day, holidays, weekends, unannounced hours, so we're there and during the daytime, and we're also there at nighttime to keep a very close eye on this facility operator because of their horrible track record in terms of regulatory compliance. We're also watching that fence line data, as you would imagine, very, very closely for any violations of the regulations which would cause them to shut down whatever it is they're doing currently until they can show compliance. And I want the committee and the public to know that we are going to be vigilant about this until this facility is completely closed and the site is cleaned up to the appropriate regulatory standards for health protection of the community. And I thank you for allowing me to be here today.
Thank you for your testimony. Earlier you mentioned that Exide was being less than candid. Could you elaborate on that? What points were there being less than candid for this committee
What I would like to do with the chairman's agreement is I'd like to supply something in writing to the committee with appropriate materials. We are still in litigation with this company over its past violations, and including in the bankruptcy court, and we'd be happy to provide information to the committee that will document what I said.
We look forward to receiving that, and certainly we're here to try to get the most accurate information as possible, and that information you could provide for us would be very helpful. Any other questions? Assembly Member Vice Chair Dolly was waiting, and then Assembly Member Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I don't know where to start. I'd like to ask DTSC, how many permits out there do we have that are in this same situation, where it's went 30 years before we either demanded that there be a permit or we shut them down? Are there many of these out there?
This was the last one.
Okay. Then my second question would be to Mr. Berry, Berry is your first name, I know. So they have an air quality permit. They had an air quality permit. So we're doing a reverse CEQA. Here's how I look at this. Basically, they didn't go through CEQA to get a permit because they didn't have a permit. So now to shut them down, we are somehow going to regulate that shutdown. Is that what I heard in all this conversation?
No. Relative to the air permits, they've had air permits.
Okay.
But the general region in Southern California had been complying with the federal outdoor air quality standard, and it was through some complaints by the neighbors regarding the emissions fallout from the facility that we then took a much closer look at the facility and discovered that this one facility was actually causing a violation of the federal ambient air quality standard. And after that, we've been through a series of rulemakings to tighten and further tighten the requirements on this facility, as well as the other lead battery smelter that exists in our region.
So I guess I'm trying to figure out the process. We've heard from the community, or at least the supervisor that represents that community, that they need instant money to go take care of the residents out there. But you don't have a permit that you would normally have, which tells you how to shut down. So there is no really. So this is an unknown territory or unknown process to go through. Correct? Yeah, there's no closure. Exactly. There's no closure. What's the closure? There was no closure plan because there has been no permit.
There was not previously a closure plan because we had not completed the permit review for the facility. So that closure plan has been developed now and is out for public comment in draft form. We are reviewing comments we're receiving. We will finalize that in the next few months, and then Exide at that point has 30 days to begin work.
Okay. So in the meantime...
And you are correct that the facility did open without CEQA review of that opening. It's a site that's been in use, as they have said, since the early part of the last century, and the laws that govern environmental requirements and environmental review were not existing at the time that the facility that site became a lead smelter. Exide did take it over in the 80s and has been operating on the site since.
I served 16 years on a board of supervisors and went through all kinds of these processes, and I have a hard time believing that in some time that plant hasn't been remodeled or something since 1922, and I know it has, and that there should have been some oversight and some opportunity for CEQA.
Absolutely.
That's okay. We're here where we're at now, so I'm trying to figure out how we go forward. And we serve the people of the community and also protect the taxpayers of state of California. And there's going to be a lot of litigation. I feel there'll be a lot of litigation in this process. So I'm trying to come up in my mind with how we serve the constituency, maybe by taking some of our rainy day fund or finding a pot of money that we can go out and serve them. But then there's other questions in there too. Is there lead-based paint on the house? Is that contaminating? We're going to go through this process. I'll be gone. I'll be termed out by the time this washes out. I'm assuming after the courts get done with it. But for the meantime, we need to figure out how to take care of shut the plant down safely, remove the material out of there, and take care of the residents. And do that in a way that doesn't, cost the taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to sit through this couple hours. I have other meetings I need to go to, but I will be following up on this, and I will be looking forward to working with the other members who represent this area on how we move forward and how we can serve the people there the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Assemblymember Garcia.
I want to thank the chairman and the vice chairman for his comments. Ironically, the vice chairman talks about being termed out when we're done, and he's talking about litigation. But the reality is that as we hear today's presentation, we won't even be done with the cleanup by the time we're termed out in 9 years. And so, what is it that we as a legislature need to do to make sure that we're fiscally prudent and taking care of our tax dollars? But we do have extra dollars out there. This is a time where everyone's talking about how the state is flush with money and one-time uses going towards this. It's not acceptable that we've been living with Exide having a temporary permit for 30 years, and we're going to have to take another 15 years to clean that. I believe our state leaders are committed to this, but what do we need to do as a legislature? And I have a hard time when I hear Exide saying that we can only have 2 crews out there at a time doing testing and testing 24 homes a month. It's an over 1 mile radius. There's many streets out there. And so do we really have the commitment from Exide to expedite this? It's not just my constituents, but it's selfish. It's me. I've been breathing this air too for the last 38 years of my life. And so it's not acceptable that we continue to have young kids like the young man that the supervisor talked about out there. And so I think as we move forward from DTSC, from AQMD, from all of us is what do we do in collaboration to expedite this process? It's hard to go home every weekend and see my neighbors in the face and say it's going to take another 20 years. We're working on it. That's not acceptable. How do we make sure testing is done in 2 years? This is one of the best states in the whole nation. How can we be leaders there? And it's been too long. It's been too long. And so the litigation can go on for 30 years. That's the least of my worries right now. And I want to make sure the state gets its money back. But we owe it to every person that is living there to expedite this process. And I hope DTSC is starting to, by looking at different testing now, to expedite it. And what else can we do to expedite that? Because even through the numbers there, we're still talking about a decade. And it's not okay. And we have other issues. Lead and Exide is not the only issue that I deal with in my backyard. But if we're going to rebuild the public's trust, if we're going to tell these communities that they do matter, that those emails were isolated cases and that's really not the whole department, we need to deliver today on this item. Thank you.
Any quick responses? Because we have 2 more panels.
Just briefly, Mr. Chairman, I would say that I absolutely agree that we have to move forward as quickly as we possibly can on the closure of the facility and the cleanup of the community around the facility. I think about it every day. It is at the top of my list of things to be working on and moving forward and making sure it gets done and gets done right and gets done quickly every single day. I do want to point out I made a small misstatement in response to the earlier question about whether or not the facility had a closure plan. There was a closure plan as part of its interim status document. That closure plan was not adequate in our view to serve for the closure of the facility in its present condition, and that's why we required a revised closure plan to be submitted, and that is what is under review right now.
Thank you. Exide, you wanted to make some comments?
I'd just like to make one response to Barry's comment that I was disingenuous to this meeting. The question that I was asked was, are there other hot spots associated with our other smelters? And the answer to that is no. Our other smelters, what we have done is tested close in, and there is lead close in, which has been remediated at some of those other sites. The hot spots that we're seeing are rather unique to this environment that we're in, and we've done some studies on the data in the ground, the soil data. We've done some looking at that data, and close into our plant is where the impact of our stacks show. Dr. Small, a very well-known scientist and statistician who's studied these kind of impacts in many different sites, we stand behind that report. And I don't want any of you to think that I'm a disingenuous person. I've worked hard all my life to speak the truth, and if I've got something to say that's I'm going to tell you the truth. So I just wanted to respond to Barry's comment. I appreciate it.
You have a response, Barry?
I'll be submitting information to the committee, and the committee can judge. And I think you'll hear from at least one or more of the witnesses that are following that these types of smelters are known, including ones from this company, to cause significant community impacts.
Okay. We have a last question here by Assembly Member Santiago.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think it's a challenging issue for all of us to face, particularly for some of us Southern California members who live in the district. And I, for one, this is probably one of the most burning issues. I'm raising a small child there. And I think I mentioned to some of the folks who visited me yesterday on all sides. And this is challenging to understand that it's going to have an impact potentially on my child's health. But it's more daunting also to understand that it has an impact on many of our communities and their children. And there's very little that we can do about it. I think it's important to also differentiate what's mandated and required by the law and what steps Exide has taken because they're required, not because they volunteered or wanted to do good. And there's a big difference in that. And I say that it's important because when we're back in our districts, we're constantly reminded of what kinds of urgent actions we see in other communities, both by regulators, but also by companies. And we can take a look at, for example, Aliso Canyon. And certainly we had a situation that happened there, and it was quick response by the company, and it probably was a much better response than we've seen in our neighborhoods. And it's challenging for some of us to represent some of those areas to sit here and hear that you can't step up a bit further. And I'm not going to require a response right now and ask you what else can you do, particularly if this was your neighborhood. If you lived here and you were raising a child, what else would you do? But I think to understand it, how maybe some of us view it or our perspectives is we've got to live in these communities. It's not a bottom line. We're not going to be taking care of shareholders or investors or what have you, but our kids are going to breathe this, and we're going to live through this. Some of us will end up healthy, some of us will not, and that's a real challenge. And it's going to be very hard to convince us that we shouldn't do more to uphold some sort of accountability on this happening in the quickest manner. And but I would like to ask the agencies, when you do submit paperwork, and I'm not going to ask you to do it now in the interest of time, what else could be done? What else should we be doing? What is the most aggressive action that we can take? And how do we prevent this from happening ever again? And I challenge you, and I know that you'll live up to that challenge, because this is incredibly important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all the panelists, and we got 2 more to go. So thank you very much for your patience and for the community's patience. This next panel, I'm going to invite up James Well, Technical Advisor to DTSC, Mark Lopez, the Exide Advisory Group Co-Chair, Jane Williams, California Communities Against Toxics. And while they're making their way up here, I want to thank you all for being here. Similar to this last panel, I'd like you to describe your professional qualifications, your role in developing the proposed closure plan, and feel comfortable sharing with the committee your perspective on the greatest challenges to closing the facility and proposed solutions to those challenges. And then after that, we'll have one last panel, and then we'll have comments from community members or members of the public. Who's first here? Okay, and we could start with Dr. James Wells.
Actually, sir, if we may, we'll start with Jane Williams.
That's okay.
Members of the committee, members of the public, thank you for inviting me here today to give testimony on this very important issue. I am Jane Williams. I'm the Executive Director of California Communities Against Toxics, which is a statewide coalition of environmental justice groups that work on a number of different polluting industries and specific facilities in the state. I've handed you out a PowerPoint presentation that I want to walk you through, and I have left others of the presentation behind me for members of the public who might be interested. I wanted to let you know that in 1998, we worked with the UCLA Law Clinic and a number of our members of the public surrounding the Exide plant. We did comments on the Title V permit. And we have been asking the department, this department chair for Department of Toxic Substance Control is the 5th director that we asked to issue the final permits so that people on the ground could enforce the permits against Exide. So we have worked on this facility for a very long time. I also want to let you know that I chair the Sierra Club's National Air Committee. And as a part of my responsibilities in doing that, we've sued the U.S. EPA to force them to promulgate standards on all secondary lead smelters in the United States. And I also wanted to call out the fact that Terry Kano, who's here, who testified before you, was our declarant to the federal U.S. EPA and the federal courts on that. Secondary lead smelters are a problem no matter where they are. They have been a problem in this country since they were first created over 100 years ago. Let me walk you through some of the main points that I want to cover in my presentation. First of all, Exide, though it is shut down after over a 15-year-long campaign, still presents a serious potential threat to the community through lead deposition and its historic contamination. The Exide closure plan will not clean up the site. It is not a plan that's designed to clean up the site. It's designed to demolish the site. Exide has a long history of leaving contamination behind its facilities across the United States. And the pace of the residential cleanup is woefully slow, and additional resources are needed to keep children out of harm's way. As we sit here talking today and holding this hearing, we are exposing children to this very, very dangerous pollutant. The Center for Disease Control stresses that aggressive primary prevention, or stopping the problem before it becomes one, as the key approach to preventing lead poisoning. Because of the many effects of lead on young children, they are irreversible. They are not able to be fixed. They stress that the only way to avoid dangerous health consequences from lead poisoning is to stop exposing them to environmental lead. I want to tell you just briefly about the tale of two pollutants. One is mercury and one is lead. Exposure was recognized as being a problem for lead over 2,000 years ago in ancient Rome. Mercury was first identified as a serious public health threat because of Mad Hatter's disease in the 1800s. We had mercury consumption advisories for fish in the 1980s, and in 1970, the lead poisoning prevention efforts began in the United States. Exposures were recognized to be harmful to the developing brain from mercury in 2000. The low-level effect of lead was also recognized about the same time frame. But I want to point out to you that we worked with then Senator Obama to enact an export ban in 2007 for mercury. We have no export ban for lead. We have an international treaty for mercury that was signed in Minamata, Japan in 2014. And we have a soil screening level at 18 parts per million. The soil screening level for lead is 80, which is still way too high, quite frankly, to protect children. And we have no international treaty that seeks global reductions in lead. So we still are shipping lead all across the world. We are using lead, and we are a long ways from being responsible in the way in which we look at exposure to lead. Now, I want to give you a short history of not all of the Exide facilities in the country, but just a few of them.
Yeah, and if you could be succinct, because we're really short on time.
And I'm going very fast. Exide in Frisco, Texas. The facility operated from 1963 to 1969 as a lead oxide manufacturing plant. It operated from 1969 to 2012 as a lead smelter. It was closed primarily because of vehement public opposition to its continuing to operate. In June of 2015, it was found to have mishandled and improperly treated hazardous waste, and today extensive contamination has been identified off-site. I have put a map that shows the extensive fallout from Exide in Texas. If you look at the Dallas Morning News, they have covered this and the closure of this facility and the ongoing contamination from this facility a great deal. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, The facility was constructed in 1960. In 1999, it was purchased by Exide. It stopped production in 2009. Louisiana closed the facility as a state action in 2014. It is also undergoing closure right now. It is planning on leaving most of the waste in place and allowing the bayou to continually run through it. Here's a picture of what it looks like. It looks a lot like the facility that we're working on. That's Louisiana. In Connecticut, they started operation in 51. They were shut down in 81. They underwent a partial cleanup in 85. They didn't tear the plant down until 2005. Just a few years ago, in 2012, they were ordered by the Connecticut Department of Environmental Quality to dredge lead out of the Mill Creek after fish consumption advisories for lead were posted. There's still ongoing contamination at that facility. In Frankfort, Indiana, Exide ceased operation in 1999. The buildings were torn down at the insistence of the city of Frankfort in 2012. Soil contamination was remediated only last year by a Superfund time-critical emergency response action from US EPA. During the screening process for the Superfund program, it was found that the facility allegedly dumped scrapped metal and batteries in a 30-foot deep pit. It buried scrap batteries in holes that were then covered by concrete, and dust dispersed into neighborhoods during demolition.
I'm going to ask you to focus on this particular project, because we could spend a lot of time talking about a lot of other sites. You gave us four examples. That's helpful, but we need to move forward specifically on this closure plan, please.
Okay, so what I'm telling you is that Exide has a pattern and practice of contaminating communities and leaving the pollution behind. In the case of the Vernon facility, our experts tell us that offsite contamination could cost up to $500 million to remediate. Exide is not on the hook for that amount of money. We need a public source of revenue. Otherwise, by the time you chase Exide down, you'll have another generation of children growing up, just like at all of these sites. Decades have gone by. The waste has been left in place, and the people are continuing to be exposed to it. So we are asking the legislature to take a serious look at passing a battery fee. A battery fee would generate many hundreds of millions of dollars every year. It could be used to not only clean up the Exide facility, but also other lead-contaminated facilities that exist in the state from the state's use of car batteries. CERCLA is a very good tool, but it is very long. You might take another 25 years to get cost recovery from the responsible parties. We can't wait that long. Thank you for your kind attention to my remarks.